This report was written during a war. It was detailed, it was accurate, and then it disappeared. Not destroyed, not classified, just never filed. It vanished from the official record, a ghost in the machine of military bureaucracy. By the end of this video, you'll understand how one ignored document quietly shaped the outcome of a conflict. You'll see why history rarely mentions it, and how a simple act of omission can change the course of events more profoundly than any grand decision. This is the story of the truth that was left on the sidelines. In every war, there are official reports. They are filed, stamped, and archived. They become the primary sources, the building blocks of what we call history. These are the documents that fill textbooks and documentaries, telling the story of victories and defeats, of strategies and outcomes. They create the official narrative, but alongside these formal records, there are other documents, shadow reports, you might call them. They're written by officers in the field, by sharp-eyed intelligence analysts, by observers who see the unfiltered reality on the ground. These accounts are often brutally accurate. They are also, frequently, uncomfortable. They challenge the accepted wisdom, they contradict the optimistic briefings, and they present truths that are politically inconvenient. Our story begins with one of those documents, born in the early, confusing days of a major conflict. The war was the Vietnam War. At the highest levels, American commanders projected an air of unshakable confidence. Publicly, every press conference spoke of steady progress, of enemy body counts, of light at the end of the tunnel. The official story was one of impending victory. But privately, within the ranks, doubts were beginning to grow. The reality on the ground felt different from the reports being sent up the chain of command. A gap was opening between the war being fought and the war being described. Into this gap stepped a mid-level intelligence officer. He wasn't a general, not a policymaker. He was just a professional, tasked with a seemingly simple job: compile field observations from across the country. He was explicitly told not to offer opinions, not to make grand strategic predictions. His job was to gather facts, just the facts. He spoke with unit commanders, fresh from firefights, with advisors working in remote villages, and with analysts sifting through captured enemy documents. He collected data on troop movements, on local sentiment, on the effectiveness of new tactics. And as he put it all together, a picture began to emerge. What he wrote didn't describe a catastrophic defeat. It didn't predict an imminent collapse. It simply described reality, and that reality was starkly different from the official narrative. The document was straightforward, professional, and deeply troubling. The report he compiled highlighted three critical problems that were being systematically overlooked. First, the enemy was not weakening in the way official metrics suggested. They were adapting. For every new American tactic, they developed a counter-tactic. They were masters of evasion, of surprise, and of exploiting the terrain. They were absorbing tremendous losses, yes, but their will to fight was not breaking. In fact, it seemed to be hardening. They were playing a long game, and the American strategy wasn't built for that. Second, the report argued that support from the local population was dangerously misunderstood. On paper, the data looked good. The Hearts and Minds campaign was generating positive statistics. Villages were being pacified, local militias were being armed, and government officials were being installed. But the report revealed that this support was often a thin veneer. It was loyalty born of coercion or convenience, not conviction. In many areas, the population was either secretly sympathetic to the enemy or simply trying to survive by telling the Americans what they wanted to hear. The reality on the ground did not match the charts and graphs in the briefing rooms. Third, the timelines for success were being driven by political pressures, not strategic realities. The war had a political clock back in Washington, an election cycle that demanded visible progress. This created an intense pressure to show results, fast. But the war on the ground had its own rhythm, its own brutal logic. The report suggested that the rush for short-term gains was actually undermining the long-term strategic goals. The enemy knew this and was using it to their advantage, waiting out the American political cycle. The report ended with a single, calm, direct warning. Current assumptions do not reflect conditions on the ground. It was a simple statement of fact, but its implications were enormous. It was a quiet alarm bell, rung with professional precision. The report was submitted properly, through the correct channels. It landed on one desk, then another, moving up the chain of command as it was supposed to. It reached the level where it could have made a difference, where it could have informed the next major strategic assessment. And then, nothing happened. There was no formal response. There was no rejection. It wasn't classified as top secret and locked away. It was simply set aside. It was not included in the final, official assessment that went to the top generals and policymakers. Other documents, the ones that emphasized optimism and aligned with the existing strategy, were pushed forward. This one did not, so it stayed out of the file. It was an inconvenient truth, and the easiest way to deal with an inconvenient truth is to ignore it. The system, designed to process information, simply chose not to process this piece. In the months that followed, the predictions implicitly contained within the unfiled report began to come true. The costs of the war, both in money and in lives, continued to increase. American casualties rose steadily. Back home, public confidence, which had been buoyed by optimistic reports, began to decline as the reality of the war became undeniable. The gap between what the public was being told and what they were seeing on their television screens grew wider and wider. Years later, as the war dragged on, military analysts and historians began the painstaking work of reviewing the early documents. They were trying to answer a simple question: how did we get it so wrong? They sifted through thousands of pages of official records, looking for the point where the strategy diverged from reality, and they noticed something strange. The conclusions they were now reaching about the enemy's resilience, about the weakness of local support, about the flawed timelines, were not entirely new. The data was there, scattered across various field reports and intelligence summaries from the early years. The warning signs had existed, but one comprehensive, early document that tied it all together was missing from the official archive. The report existed. They could find people who remembered it, but it was nowhere in the official file. It was a ghost, a memory in the minds of a few officers, but not a part of the written record. It had been left outside the story. The full revelation came decades later, not in a shocking government exposé or a major news headline. It surfaced in a footnote, a single academic reference buried deep inside a dense historian's book on the war. The historian had tracked down the original author and a surviving copy of the report. When the text of that long-lost document was compared to the actual events that followed its writing, its accuracy was unsettling. Every point it made, every quiet warning it issued, had been proven correct by the brutal passage of time. The report wasn't wrong. It was just early, and it was inconvenient. It challenged the prevailing wisdom at a time when the institution was committed to a specific path, and it was easier to ignore the warning than to question the entire mission. History, as we know it, remembers the major decisions, the famous battles, and the powerful leaders. It rarely remembers the documents that warned against those decisions. What happened to this report wasn't a dramatic act of censorship. No one was ordered to burn it, no one was silenced. It was a quieter, more insidious process, omission. The report was simply not included. It was left out of the conversation. And in the halls of power, omission can be just as powerful as an outright lie. It shapes the reality that decision-makers see, and by extension, it shapes the future. A story with a missing piece is not the whole story. In the end, history isn't always written by those who were right. It's often written by what was officially filed, by what made it into the archive. The formal record becomes the accepted truth, while the inconvenient truths are left in dusty boxes or forgotten footnotes. This story is a reminder that sometimes the most important piece of the puzzle, the key that could have unlocked a different outcome, was never even considered part of the record. If you're interested in the stories that history forgot to file, the truths that were left on the cutting room floor, Unfiled History publishes new videos exploring these hidden narratives every day. Thanks for watching.